Welcome to Listen Podcast YouTube channel. Today we're going to be diving into the latest election buzz with a special focus on Florida. But first, to set the stage, let's look at what's happening nationally.
Okay, sure. Well, the big story right now is how incredibly tight the presidential race is. The most recent Florida Atlantic University poll shows Harris, the Democrat, ahead of Trump by a mere 2 percentage points, 49 to 47.
Wow.
And it's a similar story. For the House of Representatives, a dead heat at 46% for both parties.
So it sounds like every vote really counts this time around. But you mentioned a special focus on Florida. What makes the Sunshine State stand out in this election cycle?
While the national picture is a real nail-biter, Florida presents a very different scenario. The same FAU poll reveals Trump leading Harris in the state by a more comfortable margin, 53% to 44%.
It's quite a contrast. It seems like Florida might be leaning more towards Trump than the rest of the nation. Is this reflected in other Florida races like the Senate race?
Yeah. The Senate race in Florida is also showing a lead for the Republican candidate Rick Scott, but it's not as decisive as Trump's lead. Scott is polling at 50% against Democrat Debbie Mucarsel-Powell at 46%.
Interesting.
This suggests that while Florida might be leaning red, there's still room for shifts in the coming weeks.
Definitely a race to watch closely. Now, beyond the candidates, Florida also has some hot-button amendments on the ballot this year. Let's unpack those, starting with Amendment 3.
All right. Amendment 3 proposes legalizing recreational marijuana for adults 21 and older. This is a big one. And it's currently polling quite favorably, with 60% of voters in support. However, to actually become law, it needs to maintain that 60% on voting day itself.
So strong showing so far, but the fight isn't over yet. Now, what about Amendment 4? What's at stake there?
Amendment 4 focuses on abortion rights. Specifically, it aims to enshrine the right to an abortion in Florida up to the point of fetal viability, or when necessary for the patient's health. This amendment also enjoys significant support, with 58% of Florida voters in favor.
Wow. It'll be interesting to see how these amendments alongside these close races play out come Election Day. Absolutely. With all this talk of voting and amendments, I'm curious about how Floridians are actually casting their ballots this year. Are they mainly opting for mail-in, in-person on Election Day, or early voting?
Well, the FAU poll sheds light on that as well. Early in-person voting is the clear favorite among Florida voters, with a significant 51% choosing this option.
Wow, that's over half of the voters. It seems Floridians are eager to get their votes in early. Where do mail-in ballots and Election Day voting stand in comparison?
Mail-in ballots come in second at 21%, and then surprisingly, only 18% plan to vote on Election Day itself.
So early voting is dominating the scene in Florida. But amidst all this election activity, there's also a brewing controversy, right? I'm talking about those state-funded ads, urging voters to oppose Amendments 3 and 4.
Yes, this is where things get particularly interesting. Political ads during election season aren't unusual, but what's raising eyebrows this time is the source of the funding for these particular ads. Taxpayer money. We're talking funds from the Departments of Health, Children and Families, and Education being used to sponsor ads that explicitly campaign against these ballot initiatives.
There's certainly raising questions
Yeah.
about the government's role in influencing the vote. And I imagine there are strong opinions on both sides of this issue.
Exactly. You have individuals like Ben Wilcox from Integrity Florida, a nonpartisan government watchdog group, arguing that this is a blatant misuse of state funds. They believe that using taxpayer money to campaign against ballot initiatives, regardless of the content, is an inappropriate attempt to sway voters and blurs the line between governing and electioneering.
That perspective makes sense. But what's the counter-argument? Why does the state defend using taxpayer money for these ads?
The state, specifically Lieutenant Governor Jeanette Nunez, maintains that it's their responsibility to educate voters. Their stance is that these ads are simply public service announcements, informing the public, which is something the state has always done.
So one side sees it as potential manipulation, while the other argues it's simply fulfilling a duty to inform. That raises a lot of questions about where the line is drawn between informing the public and influencing their vote.
It certainly does. The ethical and democratic implications of a government using its resources to potentially sway voters on ballot initiatives are significant and worth exploring further.
Absolutely. This is a complex issue with potentially far-reaching consequences. But before we get into those deeper implications, let's switch gears for a moment and look at some other interesting findings from the national polls.
You mentioned some other interesting national findings. One that caught my eye was public perception of Elon Musk's activity on social media.
Right. It seems like Musk is always making headlines these days. In this poll, delved into how voters feel about his influence. And it turns out there's a stark partisan divide when it comes to his social media presence.
Yeah, for sure. The poll revealed that a significant majority of Republican voters, 68%, view Musk's social media activity favorably, while only 28% of Democrat voters shared that sentiment.
Interesting.
This highlights how deeply polarized opinions are, even extending to figures like Musk,
Well,
who aren't directly on the ballot.
it really shows how social media and public figures can impact the political landscape. This poll also highlighted another interesting trend: differences in how Democrats and Republicans prefer to vote.
Right. When it comes to casting ballots, it seems Democrats are more inclined towards mail-in voting, with 54% favoring that method. In contrast, Republicans express a stronger preference for in-person voting, with 62% choosing that option.
Fascinating. Makes you wonder if those differing preferences are influenced by concerns about election security, or simply reflect ingrained habits and trust in certain voting systems.
Yeah, it's a complex issue. And the poll also touched on voter satisfaction with U.S. democracy itself, and this is where we see another significant partisan divide.
Tell me more about that.
Well, the poll found that a substantial 75% of Republican voters expressed satisfaction with the state of U.S. democracy, whereas only 38% of Democrat voters share that sentiment.
Wow.
This difference in perception is quite striking and underscores the deep divisions within the electorate.
It's a sobering reminder that even the fundamental principles of our democracy are viewed through very different lenses, depending on party affiliation. Now, amidst these stark partisan divides, the poll also offered some insights into the overall life satisfaction.
Yeah. Despite the political tensions and disagreements, it's interesting to note that a majority of voters across party lines actually report being satisfied with their lives. 60% of Republicans and 54% of Democrats indicated they are satisfied with the way things are going in their personal lives.
That's a bit of a silver lining amidst all the political drama. It seems, at least on an individual level. People are finding contentment, despite the heated political climate.
Perhaps this suggests that while we might be deeply divided on political issues, there's still a shared sense of well-being and hope on a personal level.
It's a good reminder that beyond the headlines and political battles, there's a whole world of individual experiences and aspirations that shape how we view the world. But let's bring it back to those Florida amendments and the controversy surrounding those state-funded ads. It seems like there's a lot to unpack there in terms of the ethical and democratic implications.
Absolutely. It raises some fundamental questions about the role of government in a democracy, especially during elections. Where do we draw the line between informing the public and attempting to sway their vote? And what are the potential consequences of blurring that line?
Those are crucial questions. It seems like the state's argument hinges on the idea that these ads are simply providing information, but the use of taxpayer money to specifically target ballot initiatives makes it feel a bit more complicated than that.
Precisely. One could argue that by funding ads that advocate against specific amendments, the state is essentially taking a side and using its resources to influence the outcome of the vote.
And that raises concerns about fairness and whether all sides have equal opportunity to present their case to the voters. If the state, with its vast resources, is actively campaigning against certain initiatives, does that create an uneven playing field?
That's a valid point. It's crucial to consider whether this practice could potentially discourage some voters from engaging in the process altogether if they perceive the system as biased or feel their vote won't truly count. It could lead to apathy and disengagement.
That's a dangerous path, especially in a democracy where citizen participation is the cornerstone of a functioning government. But let's flip the coin for a moment and consider the state's perspective. They argue they have a duty to educate voters, and that these ads are simply part of that effort.
Yes, and it's important to acknowledge that voter education is indeed a vital aspect of a healthy democracy. Informed citizens are better equipped to make decisions that reflect their values and interests. However, the key question here is whether these particular ads, funded by taxpayer money, and specifically targeting certain ballot initiatives, truly qualify as unbiased education.
Right. It's that targeted approach and the source of the funding that make it feel different from a general voter education campaign. It raises questions about whether the intent is truly to inform or whether there's an underlying agenda to sway the vote in a particular direction.
And that brings us back to the heart of the matter: transparency and accountability. Voters deserve to know who's behind the messages they're receiving, what their motivations are, and whether those messages are being presented in a fair and balanced manner.
Transparency is essential for building trust in the democratic process. Without it, skepticism and cynicism can take root, further eroding public faith in the system.
Exactly. So while the state's argument about voter education holds some weight, the way these ads are being funded and targeted raises legitimate concerns about transparency, fairness, and the potential for undue influence on the electoral process.
It's a complex issue with no easy answers, and it underscores the importance of critical thinking and informed engagement from voters. So with all these complexities surrounding the election,
Yeah.
what advice do you have for voters in Florida trying to navigate these tight races and controversial amendments and potentially biased information?
Well, I think the most important thing is to be an informed voter. Don't just rely on headlines or social media posts. Dig deeper, explore different perspectives and be critical of the information you encounter.
So you're saying go beyond just reading the ballot summaries and really research the issues and candidates.
Exactly. Look for in-depth articles from reputable news organizations. There are also nonpartisan organizations that specialize in analyzing policy and elections. Websites like Ballotpedia or Vote for 11 can be great resources for unbiased information on these very ballot measures.
That makes sense. Diversify your news sources and don't let social media be your only source of information.
Yeah, social media can be useful for staying up to date, but it's also a breeding ground for misinformation and echo chambers. So always cross-reference what you see online and be wary of anything that feels sensationalized or uses overly emotional language.
It's all about being a discerning consumer of information, especially during election season.
Absolutely. And remember, voting is both a right and a responsibility. It's not just about showing up at the polls. It's about being an engaged citizen who understands the issues and makes informed choices. Your vote is your voice, so use it wisely.
Well said. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the tight national races to the unique situation in Florida, and of course the controversy surrounding those state-funded ads.
Yeah, we've seen how seemingly straightforward issues like voter education can become intertwined with complex ethical and democratic considerations.
Ultimately, the power rests with the voters. They have the responsibility to inform themselves, think critically, and make their voices heard through their vote.
And with that thought, we'll wrap up this deep dive. We encourage you to continue exploring these issues, forming your own opinions, and participating actively in our democracy.